His position is sometimes referred to as the mayor of Merritt Island, but Brevard County Commissioner Chuck Nelson's responsibilities extend well beyond the residents of that area. Nelson represents Brevard County on the group of governments planning for a cleanup of the polluted Indian River Lagoon. He has been instrumental in making improvements for business and property owners all along State Road 520, and during much of his 7 years on the commission, the Republican has voted to pass budgets that cut jobs and reduced overall spending while coping with a recession and thousands of space shuttle layoffs. Nelson's district includes Merritt Island, Cocoa Beach, Cape Canaveral, Cocoa, and Rockledge. I questioned him in our Florida Today studio. Commissioner Nelson, it's great to have you back on the program again.
Well, thanks for having me back, Matt.
Top issue for us this year is the Indian River Lagoon. I know that you've been a delegate to at least one advisory board, and there was a big assembly. Fill us in on what's going on.
Well, I'm the county's representative on the five-county collaborative, which was created by Commissioner Ed Fielding out of Martin County, but it includes Martin, St. Lucie, Indian River, Volusia, and Brevard counties. And we're getting together to try to identify what the issues are and how we might be able to impact funding coming to the lagoon for, in effect, cleaning up the mess we found ourselves in.
So the polluted lagoon,
yeah.
Lots of lost seagrass. I think one scientist described it as losing, if this were a rainforest and you lost that many acres of rainforest as we've lost seagrass, people would be crying bloody murder.
It's been pretty tragic, and Brevard County has about 70% of the water body of the lagoon itself, so we've got a huge stake in the outcome of this. And one thing that's very clear, each area's got a different kind of problem, but they're all interrelated. But for instance, the Lake Okeechobee discharges down in St. Lucie and Martin County really don't impact us, but they're horrible down there. It's some of the ugliest stuff I've ever seen in terms of an algae. But we all have some common threads, whether it's fertilizers, septic systems, untreated drainage coming into the lagoon. So we've got our work cut out for us.
You made the comment that at this point there's no general leading the Army to solve the problem, and we need one in some fashion. Would you explain that?
What I see is that there are a lot of great people with a lot of concern, and coordinating those efforts and having them begin to take hold has been kind of the challenge, because as I said, each area is different. I think that between the collaborative and the work that's going to come out of the assembly, which I was participated in this last weekend, I think you're going to see some more direction. The National Estuary Program, Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program, is looking to actually become autonomous from St. John's, and that'll give it a greater ability to become an advocate for the lagoon. Right now, because it's in a governmental unit, it tends to kind of curtail its ability to get that message out. So I think within this next year, you're going to see that general rise in the organization come together.
Well, I know that I've heard politicians like Congressman Bill Posey and incoming House Speaker Steve Crisafulli talk about kind of the need for there to be some kind of a point agency that would be where you deliver the dollars, for lack of a better phrase.
And that's the devil in the detail. And I think there's you're going to see over the summer a lot of effort in that area of trying to coordinate. Now we do have, and thanks to Representative Crisafulli, some money coming this way for dredging Eau Gallie River and then some other muck areas that we need to take care of, because turbidity, believe it or not, is a big problem. Every time a storm comes through, the color of the water changes and sunlight doesn't get down to seagrass. So there's a legacy load that we need to get rid of in the river.
What about I've heard this idea floated a few times about opening up the locks at Port Canaveral. Isn't that in your district? Have you ever explored that? I mean,
it is.
Help flush things out a little bit?
The preliminary information I have is that it would take an opening of almost 1,400 feet to have any significant impact. The locks were opened actually after a hurricane a few years ago. They immediately silted in. They had to shut down the locks for almost 3 months to dredge out. So it would be extremely difficult to use our locks to do that, and it would have a very localized impact. I think the reality is that the cost to create that kind of opening would just be prohibitive. There's really no good location. You'd have to buy land. You'd be always fighting it and having to continue to refund the dredging to keep it open. So I think that's probably not workable. I think our efforts can be better served by looking at other inputs into the lagoon. It was okay for, we were healthy,
right,
and now we're not. So let's deal with what made us unhealthy.
In other words, we wouldn't have to worry about going through 10 years of permitting and all the expense and dealing with federal agencies to open a hole someplace. We just stopped putting the pollution into it in the first place.
Some of the discussion at the Assembly was actually looking at stormwater as a resource instead of as a problem. In other words, begin to use it for more purposes, irrigation. There's a new concept called water farming. There's all sorts of ways that we can begin to clean up the stormwater that's coming in and address those issues, and do it in a way that, in a state that needs all the water it can get in terms of its population, begin to use that as part of the answer to that problem.
Well, it sounds to me like if we ever figure out how to turn Lake Okeechobee into the reservoir for South Florida somehow, that we might really solve some of the problems of that water flushing into the lagoon.
Those discharges, and they're done for safety purposes. They don't want to lose the south bank of Lake Okeechobee, similar to what happened in the 20s at a hurricane. So they lower the level of the lake, and that's when we get the pretty nasty discharges into not only this coast but also to the west coast.
Wow. Let's talk a little bit about I know this isn't necessarily what you decide as a county commissioner, but there's a lot going on up at Port Canaveral, which is right in your kind of district area, with potential impacts on District 2. This week, for example, there are some meetings going on regarding cargo operations, potential new rail lines that go through from Port Canaveral over to through your area. There's a new terminal going up. I mean, I couldn't believe how fast that was happening up there with a new marina and some more development at the Cove. How do you see some of that affecting District 2?
On the community side, certainly we talk among ourselves about the changes at the port, and I think in general they're positive. But I think there's a moment where they need to take kind of a deep breath and see, okay, is the community on board? The issue of, for instance, rail, I think is going to become a bigger issue as they move further into that discussion. I think for instance, DOT has moved the widening of State Road 528, the beach line, up into the current work year. So they're actually starting to do some 6-laning design of that. And all of those things, I think, are going to impact the neighborhood. I've talked to several of the port commissioners and have said, what happens inside the port impacts me outside the port as well. So you need to be careful not to do something, for instance, that hurts the shopping at the Merritt Square Mall or the TJ Maxx, where we have the crews that come over and shop there. So keeping the crews inside the port actually hurts us outside the port.
Interesting. With the widening of the road, it's more than just the widening of the road. We could potentially be seeing more trucks with containers on them, or fuel. Is that part of the issue?
I think initially the widening is for two purposes, of course: additional cruise traffic, but also the cargo. And they're working on the inland port concept where they would barge the material over to Port St. John. But there will naturally be some additional cargo traffic on 528. So they need to address that and be prepared for it.
Well, if they can find out a way to make it work so that quality of life is still great on Merritt Island, but they're getting all this cargo work and all this economic growth out of it too, that seems like the best of both worlds.
I think so, and I've stressed with Department of Transportation, there are recreational uses that occur on the causeways, and we need to preserve those and plan for them. Kind of the uncontrolled access that we have now is to some extent dangerous. My worst nightmare is a car that leaves the highway and runs through a picnic kind of concept. So there are examples around the Courtney Campbell Causeway between Tampa and Clearwater where they've addressed the transportation need but also retained the recreation uses. And so
you can bike and walk and hike and do all those kinds of things.
Absolutely, because it's a great amenity. It's got a long history of use, and so we need to preserve that.
Interesting. Any talks about rail running over those at all in the long-time future?
I threatened Commissioner Fisher. I said he seems to be obsessed with running rail through my district, but I think that's going to be a heavy lift. It came up in the 90s. It was not well supported. And you can see now with All Aboard Florida, the discussions that are evolving out of that. So I think it's going to be an interesting discussion.
Let's talk about All Aboard Florida. This is the venture, totally private venture this time. by Florida East Coast Railways, Flagler Development, the old railroad that's been around forever in Florida. Try to get some passenger trains running, I think as early as 2016. The weird issue for Brevard is that they're planning on hauling through here 32 times a day with short trains, but without stopping. What's your take?
Well, I think that the greatest issue for us will be the quiet zone issue and the cost of creating those. I think it's fair that we have the quiet zones, and that's so you don't have to have the whistles 32 times a day plus the freight traffic. We just have to make sure that we're not getting impacted. As far as the stop, I really believe that's a long-term question. At some point, this will probably go to Jacksonville, and it would be logical to have a COCO terminal so you could go north or south on that system. So it is a private venture, and if you ever want to find out how powerful railroads are, just we have to ask for permission to cross the railroad, and we have these agreements that they give us that right. So you can imagine it's private property, and so they have a stronger right, and our federal government and the nation supports railroads. So it's going to be an interesting discussion. I
think two of the pieces of information that readers would find most surprising when we talked to All Aboard Florida people was that, one, most of those crossings that we get frustrated that we have to sit at and watch trains go by, those crossings were there, those roads crossed the railroad tracks long after the tracks were there. And we have contracts and agreements to be able to cross their tracks as our towns grew. And then I think secondly was that those train horns are, when and how loud they blow is dictated by the federal government and for safety reasons.
Right. I think that there's a process of quiet zones that would be beneficial even for the freight side. So we just need to make sure that they contribute a fair share to that process.
Well, the commission, a resolution came up, I think in the last week or two, that failed on a 2-2 vote that would urge federal and state agencies to require the railroad to pay for the cost of creating quiet zones at crossings and withhold all government assistance to All Aboard Florida. You voted no on that. Why?
I think it's too early in the process to take a position because there's so many unknowns, and I want to have the facts that we can defend instead of kind of a knee-jerk reaction, because I've also heard a whole variety of reasons why this shouldn't happen that aren't necessarily based in fact. And so I want to get good information. We have plenty of time as a board to then react to that. So I don't want to foul up some opportunity to make sure we get our fair treatment from the railroad by jumping out too quickly.
Not creating an adversarial relationship before you necessarily have to.
Absolutely.
Well, now I understand there's also still our plans for Amtrak to run passenger service through with stops in COCO where they're going to do some, and elsewhere. Is that still on the
the Amtrak route is still under discussion, and they're still working the funding out, but there would be 3 stops in the county for Amtrak.
So it's not that we're without service, it's just that we naysayers who have pretty much shot down any other rail service in Florida are going to have to wait to see if this other private venture succeeds first before we can persuade them to stop in Brevard County. One of the, I know has been an ongoing effort by you and your staff and is just improvements along State Road 520.
Yeah.
We talked in a previous interview about efforts made along the commercial area there near the mall to sort of replumb and attach properties to a drainage pond or lake that was going in to sort of help facilitate development. What's going on with that?
We've just finished the actual creation of the lake. It's between 22, 23 acres, and it actually takes the water from about 180 acres of urban runoff, and it typically had gone directly into Newfound Harbor, which is part of Sykes Creek and the lagoon. And now it will be diverted through this lake system, which then treats it before it gets discharged. So we're taking the pollutants out of the stream. But it also gives us the ability to do better redevelopment of that 180 acres. So you've got some prime urban land that if you were to try to develop, you'd have to bring it up to current standards today. And in the case of a car dealership there, 17 acres, they'd have to give up almost 20% of their land to a hole in the ground to treat water. They can now buy credits from us, and we'll treat their water, and they can get full utilization of that. So it's better utilizing commercial property for the purposes that it was intended. And the benefit, besides treating the water, besides the redevelopment, is that we're expanding Veterans Memorial Park. And there'll be walkways around it, and it'll become an actual amenity similar to what you've seen at Lake Eola and some of the other facilities over in the central part of the state.
That big of a lake?
It's large. When you, I guarantee you, by the time you try to walk around it, it's going to be. I think it's going to be a great attraction.
Now, this is a project that was funded by a community redevelopment agency on Merritt Island. Is that correct?
It's a combination of funding sources. The redevelopment agency and the Parks and Recreation Department went together for the acquisition of the land. The actual treatment part of that was paid for through stormwater and grants, mostly grants. Okay. And the work that was done in terms of the piping was done as part of a road project. We were getting close to a similar situation that they had in Palm Bay, where the system underground was metal pipe starting to fail, and we were fortunate that we were able to put the project together before that actually happened. So we used a variety of resources to accomplish a goal. I really think that the sum of the parts is much greater than the whole. So it's been a great project.
So when will we see some of the development or redevelopment of some of these properties along 520?
We're literally talking with the mall right now. They've got some retention ponds. Half of the mall goes directly into the lagoon, and so we're looking to redirect that into the pond. But they have some retention ponds that did meet the standards, although they're not as up to today's standards. And we've talked to them about selling them the dirt to fill those ponds and to have them pay us for the treatment of the water, so that we've got better commercial space. We've got this thing called the back of the mall, and that's really not good if you're a mall owner. And what we're trying to do is to turn it into a more vibrant commercial corridor.
Neat. Somewhere along 520, I've heard that there are a lot of palm trees that have gone up in the last couple of years, $1 million worth of palm trees or something like that. I have not seen those yet, or at least I haven't seen them sprouting like blades of grass, as I've heard them described in Facebook comments. What's the deal?
Well, there's a 3-mile corridor from Cocoa, the Hubert Humphrey Bridge, over to East Merritt Island and the Banana River. DOT had 2 projects that they were involved in. One was replacing mast arms through the central part of the island, and another was what they called the safety project. DOT sets aside money for landscaping, so our redevelopment agency partnered with them to begin to do a landscaping project similar to what all our other communities have done.
Sure.
I think the irony for me is that we've been criticized because there was a certain palm that was, I think it was like $5,000 was the quote. These palms are used everywhere. Palm Bay put in 29 of these palms along the US 1 project through their redevelopment agency, and nobody criticized them. So I think to some extent the criticism comes from the political side of it. Merritt Island Redevelopment Agency is the only county redevelopment agency. The ones in the south part of the county, particularly my commissioner from District 3, has not gone after them for the same things that we're doing on Merritt Island, just after Merritt Island. So I think it's more political than anything. I will tell you that the folks that I deal with that live on Merritt Island, that live in Cocoa Beach, are just very pleased to see it. The businesses along there appreciate it. We've seen a resurgence of that corridor. We've got Starbucks now. We've got a Bonefish Grill. We've got a Harbor Freight. We've seen renovation of Outback and some of the other properties. So it's starting to pay dividends. And the state wouldn't do this if they didn't think there was a return on investment. And they've done the studies that indicate that it is. So we're real pleased.
So good share of money that came in from Florida Department of Transportation?
Yeah, we got a grant. I don't remember the exact amount. I think, and the project in total was about $1.2 million, and I think one of the change orders was maybe $1.4 million. But it put in brick pavers that actually reduced the grass that had to be maintained, and we replaced it with trees. And the trees that we got, by the way, are besides being majestic and looking great, they are cold tolerant and salt tolerant. So and they last 100 years. So you're putting the right kind of tree in the right location so that it survives.
Are they date palms?
They're date palms.
Okay.
They're medulls.
So in other words, these are the really big, really expensive ones that you see lining like the Embarcadero in San Francisco, where it's pretty cold there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that'll explain why.
And there's only 35 of them over a 3-mile stretch, so they're not growing up like weeds.
Blades of grass. I think
I'm sorry.
Was what I saw. No, I was interested, and I just wanted to ask about that.
Sure.
You're coming into sort of the home stretch for you, right?
Yeah.
You're going to
Yeah.
be 3 or 4 more months, or
I haven't calculated, but November is when the new commission gets seated, and so we're working on completing as many projects as we can, getting things in order, and we're as busy now as we have been because as the economy is coming back, we're starting to see more zoning issues. We're starting to see more requests for services. All the things that were happening back during the boom are starting to creep back into to what's going on now.
well, your position sometimes is loosely referred to as the mayor of Merritt Island because you're the main source of governance. Well, looking back on it, I mean, in your, 8 years that it will have been?
Yeah.
What do you see as some of your major accomplishments that we will say, well, that was my mark that I helped put on?
Well, I think the project along 520 and the Veterans Memorial Park expansion certainly are something I will be proud of because they weren't just beautification projects. They actually were improvement to our business community and to the commercial sector. And I think that's going to pay dividends in the future. So I think we were able to accomplish a lot. I'm very proud of Griffiths Landing at Blue Crab Cove. Griffiths Landing, we had redevelopment dollars, about $400,000 for the acquisition of a $2.8 million property. The rest came from grants. All the development is being done from grants, and it's just turned into a great gateway onto the island. So I think we're structuring ourselves, and I'm pleased to have been there to try to move some of those things forward.
If you have something that you wish you had done, or if you have a regret that you couldn't get done, what do you think that would be?
I really have thought a lot about that, and I think the one thing I regret is that that the commission couldn't have been more cordial to each other, because I really think that we've made a difficult time overly difficult. My first couple years in office, I sat with Commissioner Helen Volz, and she and I were often very philosophically far apart. But at the end of the day, we were, how's the family doing? And it was over. And I enjoyed those first 2 years. It hasn't been quite so much fun, and with the change in the commission, it's just gotten too mean-spirited.
What do you think the people in District 2 want most today from a county commissioner? I mean, there are 5 people running to succeed you at this point. I like to help define the issues so that we can go ask them about it.
Well, I think one of the things that I had promised is that I would listen to citizens, because that was kind of a criticism of the commission before I got there. And I've done well over 100 walk-ins. I continue to do those. We'll do them right up into the the last opportunity. Twice a month, I'm at libraries in Cocoa or Cocoa Beach. So listening to the community. And I also think they want to know that their money is being spent correctly and well. And it's ironic, I've done a lot of homeowner association meetings where we talk about taxes, and that's not typically the criticism. The criticism often is, why haven't we done something? And so balancing that desire to see our community improve, I think is going to be a challenge. I've told candidates, I said the 2 issues that you're going to be faced with are going to be the same ones that I had, which is growth in the environment. And if you look, we're dealing with the Indian River Lagoon, and we're starting to see rezonings and requests for land use changes. So it's back. It will be the same issues as they were when I first got elected.
What's the next big issue or challenge for the county commission?
I think the biggest issue is going to be the lack of resources. We cut ourselves pretty drastically. Now, we did not go after public safety, which included the sheriff or our fire department. I think both of those are excellent agencies, and we protected them. But we did cut back in parks and libraries, and just about every other service took a disproportionate share of that. Going forward, we may have cut too far in some of those areas, and it's going to be difficult to find the resources to deal with that. Health costs are going up for employees. That's going to be a challenge. And the charter itself limits us in our ability. We can't grow at greater than a 3% rate unless there's a vote of the public. And yeah, our property values went up 7–8% last year. We'll go up about the same this year, but we can only grow by 3%. So it's going to be an interesting challenge for the new commission to deal with those issues. It just restricts your ability to solve problems.
So financially, a recession might take property values and everything way down, but then we're kind of locked in between Save Our Homes and a bunch of new exemptions that now apply to businesses, plus the cap on growth at 3%.
Yeah. And I will tell you that the cutbacks were in some fashion good for us. I think it was good to reassess what we do, why we do it, and I think we did a good job of that. I just don't know that going forward the tools are going to be there for a new commission to deal with the growth issues that will come, and they will come.
Could you just cut taxes 10%?
Not unless you want to take firefighters and law enforcement off the road. There's not that kind of cut left. We did that. We reduced over 500 positions since I've been in office. We've cut the budget 30% in spite of what you hear on the blogs. Those are the realities of what we did. So it's lean and mean already.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, with just a minute left, was we have a succession plan for a new county manager, Stockton Witten, come in. Explain that.
Well, I think Stockton, you know, and this is no disrespect to Howard. I wish Stockton had applied for the job initially because I thought he could do the job then, and he's gotten more seasoning. I think he'll do a great job for the county. I think he brings a balance of understanding of the job along with understanding the politics of the county. So I'm looking forward. I think he was the right choice, and I think he'll do great for the future.
Chuck Nelson, thanks so much for joining us
Thank
here
you,
today.
Matt.
Good luck with the last
appreciate it.
remaining of your term, and I hope that you leave with more feelings of accomplishments than regrets.
Absolutely. It's been an honor to serve.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, that's our program. I'm Matt Reed. We'll see you right here next week on WEFS TV and FloridaToday.com.